Miracles Do Happen by Ellery Queen. The moment Henry pecked her cheek that night, CLA knew something was wrong, but all she said was, "Riley, how did it go at the office today, dear?" "All right," Henry Witter said, and CLA knew it was not the office. "What kind of day did Jod have?" "About the same, dear." Henry put his coat, hat, and rubbers in the hall closet while the other three children hunted through his pockets for the candy bars he always brought home on paydays. "It's the tiny size again," little S lisped indignantly. "I want a big one," 5-year-old Pete wailed. Eddie, who was 10 and knew the financial facts of life, merely scuttled off with his share of the loot. "Aren't you too ashamed?" CLA said to S and Pete, but Henry said in a queer voice, "Why should they be? It's true." And he went into the back bedroom to see Jody, who had been lying there for the last 3 of her 8 years. After dinner, which was beans baked around an irreducible minimum of Mr. Schultz's cheapest short ribs, CLA put Sal and Pete to bed, parked Eddie at the TV set, fixed Jod for the night, and hurried back to the kitchen. She helped Henry finish the dishes, and then the Witters sat down at the kitchen table for their weekly session, CLA with her budget notes, Henry with paper and pencil and his paycheck between them. Claire read off the items in a loud and casual voice, and Henry wrote them down in his bookkeeper copperplate: the prorated expenses, rent, gas, electricity, telephone, TV installment, life insurance, health plan, personal loans, the running expenses, food, laundry, Henry's allowance, the extras, new shoes for Pete, school notebook for Eddie, repairs for the vacuum cleaner, and then, in that dread separate column headed Jody, medicine's therapist installment on surgeon's fee for last operation. Henry added the 2 columns in silence: expenses $89.61, take-home pay $82.25, debit balance $7.36. Henry's tick began to act up. CLA started to say something, but she swallowed it. It was the Jod column again. Without the Jod column, they would be in the black, have a small savings account, and the children could get the clothes they desperately needed. CLA shut those thoughts off. Henry cleared his throat. "CLA," he began. "No," Claire cried. "No, Henry. Maybe you've given up hope on Jod, but I haven't. I'm not going to send a child of mine to a state institution, no matter what. She needs the love and help we can give her. And maybe someday, Hen, we'll, have the phone taken out or send the TV back. You're due for another raise in a few months. We can hold out." "Who said anything about sending Jod away?" Henry's voice was very queer indeed, and CLA felt a chill. "It's not that, CLA." "Then what is it?" "I knew there was something wrong the minute you came home." "It's Tully," he said. "He phoned me at the office this afternoon." "Tully?" CLA sat still. Last year, when Jod had needed her second operation and they had exhausted the annual health plan benefits, Henry had been forced to go to a loan shark for the money. "What's he want?" "I don't know." Henry reached for his cigarettes, but then he remembered that he had smoked his quota for the day, and he put the pack back in his pocket. "He just said for me to be at his office tomorrow night at 7 o'clock. "But you paid him last month's interest on the loan." "Or did you, Henry?" "Of course I did." "Then why?" "I don't know, I tell you." Dear God, CLA thought. Nothing. Nothing more now. Please. She got up to go over to Henry and put her cracked and reddened hands on his thin shoulders. "Darling, don't worry," Henry said. "Who's worrying?" But he wished his tick would stop. Sit down, Witter. Tully indicated the only other chair in the dingy office he had. Henry's folder was on his desk, and he was leafing through it. Henry sat down. The room held nothing but an old desk and swivel chair, a filing cabinet, a big metal wastebasket, a coat rack, and the client's chair. Yet it always managed to seem crowded. Everything looked cheap, used, hard-rubbed, like Tully himself. The loan shark was a paper-thin man with eyes like rusty razor blades. Nice clean file, Tully said, tossing it aside. Henry tried to meet his payments on time. He thought of all the empty-stomached lunch hours, the cigarette rations, Clara's incredible economies, the children's patched clothes, and he felt a gust of anger. "Just what is it you want, Mr. Tully?" "The principal," Tully said indifferently. Henry found himself half-standing. The moneylender leaned back with a swivel creak that crawled up Henry's spine. "I've run into a little recession, you might call it. You know, overextended. So I'm calling my loans in. Sorry, but when I took the loan, Mr. Tully, you assured me." "Now don't give me that." Tully flicked some papers from the folder, his murderous eyes suddenly intent. "There's a demand clause in these notes, friend. Want to read it over?" Henry did not try to focus. He knew what the fine print said. But last year, he would have signed anything. He had borrowed the limit from legitimate loan companies, and Tully had been his last resort. Tully lit a big cigar. "You've got 48 hours to hand me a certified check for $490. Henry put his finger on the table. "I haven't got it, Mr. Tully." "Borrow it." "I can't. I can't get any more loans. I have a crippled child, the operations, a therapist who comes in every day." The money lender picked up a letter opener with a sharp point and began to clean his fingernails. "Look, Witter, you got your troubles and I got mine. Be here Thursday night, 9 o'clock, with your check, or I take action." Henry stumbled out. Ellery was watching the Late Show on TV Thursday night when his doorbell rang. He opened the door, and a woman with a worn cloth coat thrown over her house dress fell into his arms. Her eyes were wild. "Mr. Queen, I'm Claire Witter, Mrs. Henry Witter. I live in the neighborhood, left the children with a neighbor, ran all the way. They say you help people in trouble." "Get your breath, Mrs. Witter," Ellery said, supporting her. "Just what kind of trouble are you in?" "My husband's just been picked up by the police. I understand an Inspector Queen is in charge. He's your father, I'm told." "But Henry didn't do it, Mr. Queen." "What didn't Henry do?" "Kill that money lender. They've taken Henry to the office where Tully's body was found. I don't know what to do." And Claire Witter sobbed like a little girl. Now, Ellery said. "I'll get my hat." The inspector had invited Ellery to trail along when the homicide call came in about 10:30, and Ellery had pleaded fatigue. So the old man was surprised when his son showed up not 2 hours later. "I'm representing Mrs. Witter," Ellery told him. "What's the charge against her husband?" "Suspicion of murder." "As pat as all that, Dad?" Ellery glanced around the crowded office. He had left Claire Witter in the hall in the care of a patrolman. "Is that my client?" A white-faced man with clerical shoulders was leaning against the wall, his eyes shut, and with sergeant's beef between him and the possibly tempting open window nearby. Huddled was a frowsy old lady, a dumpy woman in a smart suit, and an Italian-looking man with a big gray mustache. Inspector Queen nodded. "The one next to VY. And don't tell me Witter doesn't look the type." "He doesn't." Just goes to show. It's Witter, all right. The basket crew were carting the remains of Mr. Tully. Elle glimpsed the back of a tan jacket splattered with blood. I don't see the weapon. Knife. Tully's letter opener. We couldn't seem to raise a print, so we sent it down to the lab. Ellery looked around at the bare room, the bare floor. Those empty desks and file drawers were found open the way they are now. Nothing's been changed or removed except the letter opener. By the way, the heat was on Tully for a usury charge, and he must have got wind of it. He was getting set to skip anyway. Here's the rundown. Prouty says Tully was knifed tonight between 8:30 and 9:30. The inspector paused. Mr. Tully was leaving. Ellery hoped Claire Witter would be crying on the patrolman's shoulder when the basket passed her in the hall. There was blood on it. 3 people entered this office during that hour, the inspector resumed. That dumpy woman next to the man with the mustache, her name is Mrs. Lester. Mr. Mustache came next, he's a barber named Dominy. Finally, Witter. Who's the old lady beside Mrs. Lester? The cleaning woman of the building. She found the body. The inspector raised his voice. Mrs. Bogan. The old woman shuffled forward on her shapeless shoes. She still had her work apron on and a dust cloth bound around her lifeless white hair. Tell your story again, Mrs. Bogan. Couple minutes after 10, I comes in here to clean. She had badly fitted false teeth, and her words came bubbling and hissing out like water from a rusty forest. What do I see but Mr. Tully laying with his face on the desk and a knife sticking out of his back. There was blood everywhere. Her blurry eyes rolled, but there was nothing on the desk now. Did you touch anything, Mrs. Bogan? Ellery asked me. I ran out yelling my head off, found a cop in the street, and that's all I know, mister. I'll be seeing that knife sticking out of his back in my dreams. You didn't hear anything? A fight, an argument, between 8:30 and 9:30. I wasn't on this floor then. I was cleaning 2 floors down, Mrs. Lester said. Inspector Queen called out. The dumpy woman in the smart suit blanched under her heavy makeup. She was well into her 40s, her hair dyed to a screaming red, her figure fighting a corset. She kept biting her lips, but Ellery saw under her nervousness the expression of chronic restlessness so often worn by women with too little to do. You were one of Tully's victims too, he asked her. Don't tell my husband, Mrs. Lester said in a rapid-fire falsetto. He'd kick me out, no kidding. I had to get a loan on the cutie, see, because of, well, a bunch of us girls have a little afternoon poker club. We started out sociable, but I don't know, the limit kept getting higher. The thing is, I went into the hole for a lot of money, mostly to that Mrs. Carson. If my husband Phil knew, he's a nut against gambling. Anyway, she says if I don't pay up, she'll go to Phil. So I took a $600 loan from this shark Tully, and Tully called the loan in, Mrs. Lester. The woman's gloved hands began to writhe. He said I had to pay off the whole thing by 8:30 tonight. Meantime, I'd lost more. I swear to God, those harpies play with marked cards. So I came here at 8:30 and handed Tully $200, all I could scrape up between what I could sneak off my household money and a ring I hawked that I told Phil I lost. But Tully says nothing doing, so I start begging him to give me more time, and all he does, the rat, is sitting here emptying desk drawers and throwing away papers and ignoring me like I was dirt. Why was he doing that, Mrs. Lester? How should I know? He takes my money and says either I have the other $400 for him by tomorrow morning or he goes to my husband. I left him still tearing up papers, alive, of course. Ellery smiled. Are you kidding? Say, you don't think? Her bloated eyes began to look terrified. Mr. Dominie, Inspector Queen cut in. The barber bounded forward in bitter excitement. It took a great many haircuts and shaves to keep his 10 children in pasture and shoe leather, he exclaimed. He had a small neighborhood shop that could accommodate only so many. The neighborhood had run down, lots of poor people had moved in, Mr. Dominie said, and even with the higher prices barbers had to charge these days, things got worse and worse. Finally, he had faced the possible loss of his shop. I go to bank. Bank say, Dominie, no good risk no more, the barber shouted, brandishing his clean, hairy hands. What can I do? I go to Tully, the bloodsucker. For a year he had managed to meet Tully's usurious interest charges. Then on Tuesday, the loan shark had phoned him and demanded payment in full by Thursday night. He named 8:45 as the deadline. Where Dominie get $1,500? The mustachioed barber cried. I bring him $565. It's the best I can do. He say, Dominie, that's no good. I say, okay, Mr. Tully, you run barber shop. I work for you. He call me bad name, take my money, say, get out. I sue you. Couple hour later, the policeman, he pick me up. For what? My wife, she cry. Bambini run under bed. I no kill Tully. Then he was alive when you left this office tonight, Mr. Dominie. Ellery said. That's your story. It's true. Clearing Mrs. Lester, Inspector Queen murmured. Ellery frowned. What was Tully doing, if anything? He asked the barber. While you were here, like that lady said, he took things out of the file cabinet, tore up paper folders, bringing us the inspector, said to Henry. Sergeant V.Y. had to assist Henry forward. The bookkeeper sank into the chair, his tick working overtime. Suddenly, his nostrils expanded. He looked up. Ellery was lighting a cigarette. Might I have one? Henry asked. I've run out. Sure. No, that's all right, keep the pack. Oh no, I have another, Mr. Witter. Thanks a million. Henry inhaled hungrily. I should have cut them out long ago, he puffed and puffed. Mr. Witter, you found Tully alive at 9? Oh yes, Henry said, alive and alone. Henry nodded, clearing his throat. Dominie, the inspector murmured. Neat even, G.Y., Ellery murmured back. Tell me just what happened, Mr. Witter, after you got here. Henry lit a fresh cigarette from the butt of the old one, looked around, hesitated, then tossed the smoldering butt into the wastebasket. I told Tully I hadn't been able to raise the money. I said, you can do what you want, Mr. Tully. Sue me, have me arrested, beaten up, killed. It won't do you any good. You can't get blood from a stone. He kept sitting there behind the desk, tearing up papers and records as if he didn't hear me. But he was paying attention, all right, Henry gulped in a lungful of smoke. Because as soon as I got through, he started to chew me out. What he called me. Henry choked over the smoke. After a moment, Ellery said, yes, Mr. Witter. I never raised my hand in anger to anybody in my life, but Tully said some things to me no man could take. Real nasty things. And while he was saying them, I kept getting sorer and sorer. Henry's tick was hopping around now like a flea. I thought of all the months we'd scrimped to pay him his blood money and, at the same time, pay for the medical care my little girl Jod needs so maybe someday she'll walk again. I thought of the stockings my wife couldn't buy, the baseball cards my Eddie couldn't collect, the complaints we didn't make to the health department about the cockroaches because the landlord might get mad and somehow chisel us out of the apartment, and we'd have to rent another place at a bigger rent. I thought of a lot of things like that, and then I leaned over the desk and let Tully have it with the paper knife. Ellery asked gently, "Huh?" Henry Witter came back to the present. "No." With this, Henry made a skinny fist and looked at it. I pasted him one right on the button, Seiko. The memory of it gave him a momentary pleasure, a spark of life came into his eyes. I didn't know I could hit that hard. He went out like a light. How did he fall, Mr. Witter? On his face on the desk. I certainly was surprised, but I felt better too. So then I walked out, leaving Tully unconscious but alive. Sure. He was breathing like a walrus. Did you notice anyone in the hall or downstairs? Just the night man mopping in the lobby. And that's how we know, Inspector Queen said to his son, that nobody else entered the building between Witter's leaving and Mrs. Band's finding the body. The porter saw Witter come and go, and he was in the lobby working the whole time afterward. Yes, Val, the sergeant who had been summoned into the hall came back to rumble into the inspector's ear. That cinches it, the inspector snapped. The labs found 3 partially smeared prints on Tully's letter knife. One is Tully's. The other 2 have been identified, Witter, as yours. Henry Witter sat there with his mouth open, but then he yelped as the cigarette burned his fingers. He flung it into the wastebasket and covered his face with his hands. Ellery, fearing a fire, walked over to the basket, but he saw that it was empty except for the 2 butts. So. "Oh, Witter," Inspector Queen began. "Hold it, Dad," Ellery stooped over. "Henry, Mr. Witter, while you were seated here across the desk from Tully, did you happen to handle the letter knife?" Henry looked up dully. "I must have if my fingerprints are on it. I don't remember, but I didn't use it on Tully." "I'd remember that." "God, yes. Don't you believe me, Inspector?" "No, Inspector," Queen said. "No, Witter. I don't. Take my advice and come clean. Maybe the DA would consent to a lesser plea." "Maybe the DA would, but I won't," Ellery said. "My client will plead not guilty." Sergeant V remarked with some bitterness to no one in particular, and the beauty of it is he does it all with his little sleeves rolled up. The inspector's glance at the sergeant was a terrible thing. "How come, Ellery?" "Because they aren't here," Ellery said, waving vaguely. "Because what aren't here?" "The papers." "What papers?" "Look," Ellery said. "Mrs. Lodomini, Witter, all 3 say Tully was cleaning out his desk and file, throwing away papers and records. You told me, Dad, that nothing has been removed from this office except Tully's letter knife. Yet the file and desk drawers are cleaned out, the floor is bare, there's nothing on the desk, and the wastebasket is empty. I ask you, where are all the papers and records Tully was throwing out?" His father looked as if he had been struck by lightning. He turned toward the old cleaning woman cowering in her corner, but Ellery was there before him. "You'd been inside this office earlier tonight than you claimed, Mrs. Bogan," Ellery was saying. "Right after Witter left, in fact, and you found Tully just recovering from Witter's haymaker." The old woman blinked. "You owed Tully money too, didn't you, Mrs. Bogan?" And he put the screws on you tonight as well, while you were cleaning his office, right? You'd already emptied the wastebasket and taken the contents outside when you killed him. By the way, how did you come to owe money? The old woman blinked and blinked. Finally, she touched her liverish old lips with her old tongue and she said, "Me boy Jim's a 3 times loser. Next time he gets sent up, it's for life. And then, what's he do but hook a wad out of the till in the garage where he's working. The boss says he won't send Jim up if I pay back the money. So I borrow it off, and till I paid him his interest faithful. But tonight, Till says he wants all the money or he'll have me pinched. I didn't care about myself, I've had it, but if I wasn't around to keep an eye on Jim. I had me cleaning gloves on. I seized the knife on Tal's desk. I was in back of him." Her old face settled, but it was hard to tell whether the lines told of remorse, resignation, or indifference. But then she said, "Now who'll be keeping me Jimmy out of trouble?" Inspector Queen said furiously, "Maybe you, Mother. Maybe you just tell that story of yours to a jury." When they had taken the old lady out, Ellery nudged Henry Witter, whose mouth was open. "You still here? Don't you know there's a lady waiting for you in the hall, CLA?" Henry hauled himself out of the chair. "Oh, and you might remember," Ellery said severely, "I'm thinking of your little girl, Mr. Witter, that miracles do happen." Henry shook himself like a dog coming out of a mud hole. "You bet, Mr. Queen," he said. "Thanks for reminding me."